What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you without my certified fantabulous co-host, Grant Hughes, but we continue with the onset of our 2023-2024 NBA team look-aheads, not outlooks or previews, because these are fancy schmancier, and they're look-aheads, whatever that means. I'm so excited, as usual, to be joined by Lazarus Jackson, associated with many things over with the Detroit Bad Boys. Follow him on, I refuse to say X. I won't even change the logo. Follow him on Twitter at LazChance. That's at LazChance. He's a great basketball mind. He promotes this podcast, which we're very thankful for. And sometimes he listens to it, which is even more humbling when someone you respect listens to your podcast. So always love picking his brain about, as you may have guessed, the Detroit Pistons. But the most important question we will ask, Laz, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dan. Thank you once again for having me. When you were like, this is year 5 of us doing this, I was like, wow, my mind is kind of blown. Also, I want to shout out the Discord. As Twitter has transformed into X and done some other stuff, just having another source of basketball-related discussion points, your Discord, the HardwoodKnocks Discord, has been valuable for me. So shout out to you and that. But yeah, we're doing great, man. As you can see, I'm coming to you from like a rom-com cabin somewhere in the Upper Peninsula. And I'm ready to talk about the upcoming 2023-2024 Detroit Pistons.
Yeah, I hope anyone who's watching on YouTube appreciates that. You're there. I think you're filming, helping with the live action of Trolls, I believe, commissioned by the one and only Chance, I'm assuming.
Exactly. Just I'm one of the like many underpaid animators working on
Trolls. Probably a bad thing to say during the strike. I know there was like some exceptions to whatever.
Oh yeah, true.
We support the writers and animators and everyone but the studios, basically. That's
very
where
much
Brad and I are at. So the basic question I have to start with, and I'm sorry, it's what are your general thoughts, impressions, takeaways from the Pistons offseason? But I will preface it by saying I appreciate how thorough you always, like, you go in and you respond to all the outline topics, which I love. But I did notice when I was looking through it, and you're not the only one that said this, people were shocked that we were complimentary on this podcast of the Pistons offseason. Some were shocked because apparently, and I don't remember this, we haven't done regrades yet, we like eviscerated them last year. I don't remember what is time, but I'm shocked that so many people are shocked that we enjoyed the Pistons offseason. But where did you land on it?
So yeah, I wasn't shocked, but I was definitely surprised. You and Grant's rationale made sense, and I agreed with the rationale. However, like, normally you expect more from a team that just won 17 games and a front office that's going into year 4 of a regime that has won 17, 23, and 20 games over the last 3 seasons. And so I think Pistons fans, myself included, just expected something a little bit more, a bigger sense of urgency than what we got. There's a lot of reliance on internal development, which is not the worst plan considering the assemblage of like young talent that they've put together. However, it seems like they're still falling behind in terms of like where their young core would rank, and in terms of like where they're going to finish this season in terms of wins and losses for this season. Normally, a front office that hasn't had the success that this front office has had would do like something in terms of personnel to make you feel like they were like really trying to win games. This season, it feels like their biggest acquisition was Monty Williams, who we're going to talk about relatively quickly. But in terms of like personnel, they're really just like returning, hopefully, a fully healthy Cade Cunningham and hoping that all their young guys get better. And like that's not the worst plan, but you would have liked to see, I don't know, an addition on the wing, right? Another like 3-and-D guy. I know they were obviously like linked to Cam Johnson. You don't want to play the restricted free agency game. I understand that very well. I think Pistons fans were just hoping for like a little bit more than what they got. There's you pointed out in the question too, in the write up, is like rolling over the flexibility next season is not a bad thing, but also Pistons fans have been burned by free agency before. And so there's not a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to turn the $45 million they have in cap space next season into somebody that's like truly going to help them win, like instantly, like elevate them like to another like 10 plus, 15 plus wins, right?
I think I might have been more critical of the offseason if maybe we went through an entire year of Cade like not getting injured last season. So like you just don't have, this is basically his sophomore campaign now.
Yeah.
And it's like, so you don't have the information necessary. And I respect, because I read it as, and I think this sort of leaks into the Monty Williams conversation, that the front office, which when you point out there in year 4, is just like, wow, like, man, Troy Reaver's been here for a minute, that they have the latitude to like, hey, we don't need to rush this. And I actually think teams need to be more aggressive in going after restricted free agents. If you don't have other, like, you know, would the Joe Harris trade have still been available if you tried to poach Cam Johnson from the Nets? That's a fair question, but like you could have still, like the Monty Morris trade doesn't seem like it would have gone everywhere. Like you could have waited the amount of time for the Nets to match an offer sheet if you wanted to inflate Cam Johnson, or if you wanted to be the team. And I'm still angry about this, not Piston specific, but how did no one make the Lakers pay more for Austin Reeves with a poison pill? And so I get that frustration, but again, it just comes down to me like, well, what other move was out there? And if you knew you weren't getting Cam, I think a lot of people naturally framed as, why would they help the Nets keep Cam Johnson? It was like, because the Nets were always going to keep Cam Johnson. And so I totally understand that. I just looking at the options that might have been out there. Like, did you punt on the ongoing PJ Washington sweepstakes or something? I mean, did you sit out Austin Reeves? Like I mentioned, I think that's a fair critique, but just knowing what was out there. And again, I can't get past Cade playing in only 12 games. I want to see more about how this roster coalesces before I think that they need to make the bigger personnel swing.
That's fair. That's fair.
What did you think of the Monty Williams hire? Not just in terms of fit and any insight into how you think this team is run, but just, oh, they made it so he couldn't say no, because it sounded like he tried to say no, and they were aggressive enough that he ended up not being able to say no.
So the hire was the best thing they did this offseason by like a mile. Like you have to remember, before Monty Williams was even like fired, the names we were hearing in the Pistons coaching search were all first-time head coaches in like Charles Lee, Kevin Ollie, and Gerard Collins. And so it was like, I would have had so much more unease about this upcoming season if not only they had not done much in terms of like changing the roster personnel, but also we were going into like a first-time head coach who we like didn't have a good sense of what they were going to bring from like an offensive or defensive identity, right? So breaking the bank for Monty Williams, who has a pre-existing relationship with Troy Weaver, super important on that front. A guy who has already done what I think the Pistons want to do in terms of taking a talented team that hadn't had a lot of success to that next level, is definitely like really appealing. A guy who did it by modernizing the offense around 2-star guards. It's like we kind of have those. And so like, yeah, Monty was definitely a perfect fit in terms of situation and for this team. It's not my money. The contract reset the coaching market. I'm pleased with that. Like, honestly, I think coaches don't count against the salary cap. You talked about this a little bit in the Central Division offseason thing. But it's like, yeah, it's not my money, and you need a good coach. So it's like, just go get it. I will say though, like the stories we got about how the Pistons coaching search was going before Monty Williams was available were not very encouraging. It sounded like there was a lot of internal discussion about what to do from a coaching perspective between the GM and other members of the front office, which is not great. You would like more alignment than I think the Pistons were showing.
I do think what's interesting about it, and I agree with everything you said there, is there's almost a disconnect between what we just talked about with their offseason and what their aims ended up being. And then, oh, you spent this much on a veteran head coach, which might imply that you're looking to make not just the jump. Oh, okay, we go from 17 wins to we win 10 more games because the baseline was so low. It would infer, you would think normally that, no, like this is going to be like more of an accelerated process. But the roster kind of says something different. So do you worry about that sort of disconnect between Monty Williams, what he in theory could represent and that financial commitment versus what this team is actually rolling out on the floor?
No, because part of the financial commitment is dollars, but the other part of the financial commitment is years, right? I believe he signed a 6-year deal. And so
that was all. I felt like it was 9. The way it was just like, oh, it's for eternity.
It's like he's probably going to be there longer than the front office, right? And if there's any front office changes, and so it's like if he's going to be here for the long haul, they don't feel as much of a need to press the accelerator, right? And so in my mind, those kind of go hand in hand. But at the same time, it would have been nice to see them portray themselves as what they portray them or put themselves in a position from a personnel perspective as to what they're saying, like outwardly, which is like, we would like to be more competitive. It's like, okay, well, if you'd like, is like from a coaching perspective, like, yes, I agree. You've done things that make me agree that you want to be more competitive. From a roster perspective, less so.
I do wonder, now that you mention it, what the length of Monty's contract says about the latitude and like job security of Troy Reaver at this point, because like that's a really long contract to say, if things don't go well in year 1 or year 2 of that contract, you really going to get rid of Troy Reaver when Monty Williams has, let's say, 3 or 4 guaranteed years left on his contract.
So I will say, like, they hired Dwayne Casey in a transition period in terms of a front office, right? Like Stan was the GM and the coach. They fired him. They bring in Dwayne. Don't really hire a GM. Like Ed Stefanski was like brought in to lead the search and then kind of decided like I should run the team for a little bit. And so Tom Gores is not afraid to I think they prefer coaching continuity, right?
Okay.
If they can have it. And so like if something happens, I don't think this is going to be the case, but like if they win like 23 and 23 games the next 2 years and like the front office gets fired, I think they would still let Monty like coach out the majority of that contract if he wants to, right? Like, I don't know, maybe he wants to do something else at that point.
He'll have the money to do something else, I think. Yeah. I actually think the best thing they did, even though it was a no-brainer, was draft Ausar Thompson. I'm
glad you think this was a no-brainer, because it was not a no-brainer to a lot of people.
Which probably means that it wasn't, just because I'm like a million feet away from it. So if there was other moves or ideas on the table, maybe trading down, I respect them going after someone who fills a need, but maybe isn't the perfect functional fit. I believe in the jumper. He ended up higher than Amen Thompson on my big board for what it's worth, which is absolutely nothing. Any just early impressions of his game or insight or thoughts on how prominently he will be used as a rookie?
They love Ausar. I love Ausar. Everybody loves Ausar after Las Vegas. I don't think he starts right away, but I also don't think he gets lost in the shuffle of the rotation. They have a lot of guys who could play, but after what he showed in Vegas, I think they make space for him to play. He might already be their best perimeter defender. He showed enough basketball instinct, basketball feel to where even if the shot isn't where you would like it to be in year 1, I still think he can make contributions offensively in the half court. And when they get out in transition, he's a terror. So like you hope they're able to make that happen. Offensively, like I recently did a podcast with Omar Sankofa and Bryce Simon over at the Pistons Pulse. And they asked, like, do you think this is like before the expectations like really set in, like, do you think this is the season to get Ausar like 15 PNR, initiating pick and roll possessions a game, just so you can lay that groundwork? And my answer was like, not really. Like, I don't think. You hope that eventually becomes part of his game, but I don't expect that out of the gate, and I don't want to force feed him those reps if he's not ready for it either. But I also don't think that I don't think he'll ever be Jalen Brown, right? Like, I don't ever think he'll be even like a secondary initiator type of guy, but I do think he'll be a really, really effective player for this team from day one. I think he's a guy who he just fills in the cracks of whatever a team needs offensively and defensively. And I don't know if you've read any of like the glowing features that have come out about the Thompson twins, about like how like they eat, sleep, and breathe nothing but basketball. But it's
Right.
like that stuff makes you feel confident that they'll figure out ways to be contributors at the absolute least.
How do you feel about his jumper, which I think was that and the passing felt like it was the bigger, and you mentioned that with the PNR stuff.
Yeah.
From looking at it and again, I don't watch these guys when they're actually playing in college. Like it's all cramming before the draft. But even in summer league, there's like a it's quick enough that I'm like, he feels comfortable enough taking it. And I think there's even been just glowing. I feel like I read something that said he's already just like, you use the terms eat, sleep, and breathe. Like he's doing that with his jump shot development. And I just like compared to like kind of the slower load time on Amen's jumper. Maybe that's not the baseline I should be judging it off of, but like, I just believe in it. Like maybe it's never something that happens off the dribble, but I just believe that he's going to be a league average shooter off the catch. Not maybe from day one, obviously.
Yeah, definitely not from day one, but I think he eventually gets to like league average. League average is so like, I don't know. We're thinking about league average being like 35%, but league average is starting to creep up to like 36, like 37% as
I mean, I
well.
think off the catch, it's like 38 something, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And so I do think eventually he gets to that level as a catch and shoot guy, not so much as a off the dribble guy. I would hope that's a hope, not an expectation, right? But I will say what I do expect is that even if he hits a slightly lower level as a shooter, I expect him to be a guy who uses his athleticism to eat up space and causes problems for defenses, even without the ability to necessarily like space the floor as much as you'd like. Those guys, both the Thompson twins, seems like they will be willing to do whatever it takes to contribute to winning basketball, right? And so I have no doubt that like he will make that happen.
I was going through our outlook from last year, and I basically didn't have to change the wording of this Cade Cunningham question because we barely saw him. What are you just watching for with him heading into year 3? And I think a lot of focus has been on the shooting, but I'm starting to wonder, and this leaks into the Ausar Thompson conversation a little bit more, just do they have the spacing for him to even try to generate any rim pressure? Do you trust him to have that speed on ball to do that? Is that just not a concern for you? Just what are you watching most closely for as he goes into year 3?
I am watching for the 3-point percentage first, because I think that will if you force teams to not be able to go under, that will alleviate a lot of spacing concerns. If teams feel like they have to chase him over picks, that helps a lot in terms of spacing. That gets you into like rear contests, but he's so much bigger than the guys who will be guarding him most of the time. That gets you into the bigs coming downhill and being able to make plays for himself, and some of the bigs can make plays for themselves out of that. It opens up like, weak side help rotations. Like, and we know Cade can pass and spray passes to shooters as well. So I look at the 3-point percentage and the ability to make those threes off the dribble, because I think that opens up the rest of his game. And I feel like I said this exact same thing last year, but I'm not 100% sure. But Dan, where did Cade go in your 23 under 23 draft?
This is a good chance to own up to being a coward. So he was on my big board, and I think I mentioned that in the pod. For people who only watch the short, we obviously didn't have time to throw it in there. He was 7 or 6 on my board, and I still waited until 10 to pick him. And I threw this in the outlook too. It's just like, he was out of sight, out of mind, and now we're just way too low on him, to where I think the debate we had just in the moment, I don't even remember who went 1 through 9. I remember like the top 3, I think, was just like, oh, should we take Chet Holmgren over Cade Cunningham? And in retrospect, it's just like, no. Like, we've seen Cade Cunningham play NBA basketball, and I think Chet Holmgren's going to be really good, but there's just something about, I know the percentages don't line up, and people like to point out just how low his true shooting percentages have been. And I'm going to say this with Jaden Ivey too. The aesthetics of his game just make so much sense. And I know that's so vague, but you just watch it and you're like, no, this fucking guy can play. Like, there is just a feel there. And I think he's going to end up being like, if you told me this year he hits like 36, 37% of his step back threes, I'm going to be like, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. Last year, you could see him do a lot of damage in the mid-range prior to the injury. And I think, and other people agree with me, that the shin injury contributed a lot to the problems he had shooting. His shot was already kind of flat. And so if your shin hurts and you can't elevate the way you'd like to, it's like that probably has an impact on the way you're able to shoot. He didn't make excuses, but Cade's not the type of guy to make excuses for why his shot's not falling. So I think both with the rehab on the lower body injury, the work he's been able to do during the rehab in terms of like fixing it so the shot looks a little bit better mechanically, I'm expecting big time improvements from him as a shooter this upcoming season. We will see. But yeah, there's no way he should have been under Chet Holmgren. Come on, Dan.
Hey, he wasn't. There was a debate. So Jaden Ivey is, I came away from his rookie season mostly impressed, and I think they're different players, but one of the biggest criticisms I have of Jalen Green is it's like, dude, there's another number on the dial other than 11. And Jaden Ivey like was able to vary up his cadence more as he was going through his rookie year. And I think even his 37+% shooting on catch and shoot threes, I think he probably benefited from like a later season boon, but that's encouraging. What should we be watching for with him in year 2? And because we don't have the sample, and I know I asked you this question last year as well, what do you kind of make of the potential fit between him and Cade, especially now that, as you mentioned, he won't be starting, but Ausar Thompson is going to factor into the fold as well?
Yeah. So I was legitimately impressed with the in-season improvement we saw Jaden Ivey make last season. I think the early part of this season will be really important for both Cade and Jaden. There were times early in the season last year where it looked like Cade was working really hard to get Jaden going in a way that looked like Cade was sacrificing his own offense to do. And I think it's going to be really important for them to be able to find not a like your turn, my turn balance, but like a who can do what when balance for both of those guys. Because I do think there's a lot of room for both of them to be able to share and make plays off of each other. Cade, I think, will be there's room for Cade to move off the ball and for Jaden to initiate to give defenses a little bit of a different look. There's definitely like Monty ran a lot of like Spain pick and roll and like guard off guard ball screening for guards in Phoenix. I think there's a lot of room for the ability to create advantages for Jaden doing stuff like that. And this might not be in the plans right now just because they have a billion guards on the roster, but there's opportunity for Jaden to, play without Cade at times and like bench lineups and make a lot of hay out of those, just like decimating small, slower guards who like can't start, right? But the biggest thing I'm looking for from Jaden is actually on defense. He started off the year just like atrocious on defense, absolute tire fire. And he ended the year not that bad. I am looking to see if those improvements A, maintain, and B, continue like over the course of another season. But like Jaden's only 6'4". You can't be as bad a defender as he was for like the first 30 games of his career and be that height and like play in the playoffs, right? Okay. So I'm looking to make sure that he continues to work on the defensive part of his game. Like his inability to like navigate screens was just like super apparent. It was bad, but he got a lot better at it.
This next question, I waited for it.
Thank you for waiting, because this is the thing that gets me in trouble with Pistons fans. So I appreciate you like waiting until the 25-minute mark for me to get in trouble.
I think you got in trouble last year because of what your thoughts on Jaden Ivey, I believe. You were getting in trouble before the draft, and you got in trouble after you did this podcast too, I believe. The two big stuff. Is it maybe overblown at this point? I went back and looked at the numbers. I never want to see Jalen, Duren, and James Wiseman play together again. Is that something that's going to factor in here, or are we going to be maybe pleasantly surprised with, oh, look at how like many Bojan Bogdanovic at the 4 lineups were rolled out this season?
So I hope to God we don't see any more James Wiseman, Jalen Duren minutes. Just like point blank.
Their offensive rating together, by the way, was sub 96, and their defensive rating together was, I think, like 122. And I will say, I don't know if I mentioned this already. I mentioned it in the outline. The podcast you recorded with Ben immediately after the trade happened was just one of the best, not just Pistons related things I listened to, but just breakdowns of like fits that I can just, it was so like you skewered it, but it was like so sensible. It was one of my favorite podcasts of the year. I had to mention that.
Thank you. We're going to talk about James Wiseman later. Yeah. So we'll talk about the two bigs instead. So I think that it's two bigs, but it's two non-Stewart bigs that were the real issue. Stewart hurt his shoulder, if I remember. Isaiah Stewart, Beef Stew, hurt his shoulder towards the end of last season, if I remember correctly, and so like didn't play like the last like 25 or so games. Plus, they were trying to lose games anyway. And he showed enough strides as a like nominal 4, being able to put the ball on the floor, being able to shoot the ball a little bit for a small stretch, and the team has a lot of confidence in his ability to shoot the ball moving forward. That I feel their confidence makes me like, okay, I'm willing to wait and see on how they integrate two big lineups that include Isaiah Stewart. It's when you have two big lineups that are like Jalen Duren and Marvin Bagley, or like Marvin Bagley and James Wiseman, or Jalen Duren and James Wiseman. Those two big lineups like don't make any sense. And I really, really hope they move away from them. The other thing is that like everything we've seen from Monty Williams says that like he won't play two bigs if he feels like it's not the right move, right? Like there were some like Saric 8 minutes at time for Phoenix back when like Saric was a thing for them, but like mostly they used Saric as a backup center, and even like he was a little bit of a floor spacer and like a perimeter guy for them. But like even then, like, you know, we weren't seeing like Jacques Landale and DeAndre Ayton like play together, right? Like Monty prefers to go with guys on the wing. And so I do think if they can help it, they will play like one big lineups most of the time, especially off the bench. But yeah, the two big lineups were a mess last season. A lot of it was, I think, because of the desire to accommodate James Wiseman and like give James Wiseman the run that he hadn't gotten a chance to show at that time in the NBA. And that will be, I think, less of a concern for the team moving forward this season.
And I would think, and the stuff you point out about Monty is great. I didn't even think of that. Just having Bojan Bogdanovic, making the trade for Joe Harris, having Ausar Thompson, it made me think, okay, like, no, they're not going to be. It's just, okay, Marvin Bagley's on this roster. It's just, and like James Wiseman, not that he's breaking case of emergency. We will talk about him, but it's not. Jalen Duren is the guy. And so It's just, I look at the makeup of this roster and I'm like, they're not really heavily invested in, and like, even if they wanted to, the Isaiah Stewart extension isn't a ton of money where if it's not working, like you move around like those pieces in the rotation. So I'm hopeful, and even more hopeful now after listening to you talk about Monty Williams, that we will see the two big lineups where Stewart isn't one of the two bigs fired into the sun, almost never to return unless they're trying to lose games again at the end of the season. Speaking of Jalen Duren,
it's a really good way to lose games. I'll say that much.
And I forgot about the Beef Stew injury too. And so it's like part of it. And Bagley was injured for a bunch last year. So like maybe they were playing those two out of, I won't call it necessity, but just like, yeah, what the fuck else are we gonna do? Speaking of Jalen Duren, I am so bad at evaluating bigs before they're in the NBA. It's not even like, it's probably so funny at this point, but it's also hopeless. I am smitten by Jalen Duren. And it was just like the stuff from what I saw of the Pistons, like as the season went on, it's like, oh, it felt like he was connecting on his screens more. And, oh, that movement away from the ball was so much more fluid. This is just not, like, that is not, yes, he can do that stuff, but that is not Jalen Duren only. It's just like, oh, did he just kind of bust out a post move? Was that like a little hook shot? Was that like a flip shot? He's just like, what is the ceiling on this kid? And what are you, the cookie cutter aspect of this, what are you just watching for as he goes into year 2?
I love Jalen Duren. I'm also smitten with Jalen Duren. Paul George loves Jalen Duren. I don't know if you heard that clip from the PG podcast about him talking about Duren and going up against him.
Confession, I don't listen to a ton of player podcasts because I find them to be very superficial and uninformative. I've been told JJ Redick's is good. I've heard and I've listened to his. I've heard some of Draymond's, which that's a lot of propaganda. I've been told that I need to rectify I haven't listened to Paul George's podcast ever. I've been told I need to rectify that.
The quick aside, the thing with the player podcast is the guests need to be like pretty good, right? Because otherwise the I love a lot of the players, but the level of like questioning you're going to get from them is not going to be like exceptional most of the
Right.
time. So you need a good guest to make it work. But no, PG was just like, I'm not going to pretend I listened to the whole podcast, but PG was really complimentary of Jalen Duren. One pod after they played, he's just like, holy shit, this dude's a truck and he's 19 and he's killing us. But yeah, I was really happy that Duren was also part of the select team. He also played really well in the footage of the scrimmages we got. He put Brandon Ingram like completely under the basket on like an up and under move that was really nice. And you talked about his ability to like make flip shots and hook shots around the rim. The thing that I really appreciate that I think you don't get to see all the time, but like he shows flashes of, is his ability as a passer, right? You could do a little bit of like him passing out of the elbow, right? There was a moment, God, there was a moment and they had a home game against Denver, like super late in the season, where Denver like slept walk through the first like 3.5 quarters before Jokic was like, wait, why are we losing these guys? And just like completely eradicated them. But like there was a moment where like Duren was like hitting Wiseman on some high lows, and you were like, sure, yeah, that's cool. Like I can see what like Troy Weaver is like trying to accomplish here. There was a really nice play he made out of the short roll as a passer, like kind of earlier in the season to beat Charlotte. He hit Sadiq in the corner in a like clutch situation. That was like, oh, okay. Like despite the fact that he's 19, he's still like not panicking in the clutch and like taking the time to like hit the open guy. Cause like he was this close to like committing a charge, and instead like he just gets the ball out and makes the right play. That was one thing that like Anthony Edwards mentioned in his interviews, like about Duren at like the scrimmages at the select team, like at the practices they had before FIBA. He was like, yeah, Jalen Duren like thinks the game a lot better than I think he gets credit for. And that's one thing that like I think people need to know. I would tell people that they need to know about Jalen Duren is that he thinks the game a lot better than it looks like he would, because he looks like he's carved out of granite, right? What I am looking for him this season, though, is defense, right? He makes some like highlight level blocks, but he is 19, and like any young big, he still has to do a better job of like learning where to be defensively, putting hands in passing lanes, not trying to block every single thing that like comes along his line of sight. He had a 30-17 game against San Antonio where you're like, whoa, like 30-17 from a 19-year-old. That's crazy. But Zach Collins went for 29-11, and a lot of it was on Jalen Duren. And it's like that stuff can't happen if you want to be competitive. And so he really needs to make strides defensively. The other thing I'll say is that like his effort and motor has like been a little bit of a question. Nobody questions that like he doesn't always like want to play hard, but he does kind of do the young guy thing of like taking himself out of transition defense, like chasing offensive rebounds. The coaching staff like infamously like brought him off the bench towards the end of the season in favor of Wiseman, which is where I think you see a lot of the national confusion, because it's like, oh, they were starting Wiseman over Duren last season. Like maybe they're super prioritizing Wiseman. And it's like, no, like the coaches were like openly saying like, yeah, Duren's not conditioned enough for our taste. So like, that's why he's coming off the bench. And you would see moments in time where he'd be like huffing and puffing a little to get back in transition. And it's like, okay, you'd like to see him improve a little bit on that end as well. But yeah, like everybody's super enamored with Jalen Duren. He is the big that they're going to prioritize moving forward. Like I know Stu just got paid. Stu's part of the future. Duren is part of the future. The other guys are not necessarily part of the future. That should be made clear to everybody.
The other guy who's not part of the future, and I feel really bad saying this because he's still only 22 and he's had limited action. If there was a does the least with the most award, I feel like James Wiseman would win it.
Yeah.
What were your impressions of him during his so far short stint in Detroit?
So I did not have a positive impression of James Wiseman going into the trade. You mentioned the podcast episode Ben and I did about what James Wiseman would and would not bring to the Pistons. That mostly turned out correct, I think. But watching him for the 25 or so games we got to see him, like I understood what they were going for, right? There are moments where he does something at his size and with his coordination and his like fluidity athletically that make you go like, oh my gosh, like I totally get it. At the same time, if you want to win games, you just can't play him, right? is like, yes, he's 22, but he still has no clue where to be on defense and did not like make any strides in that area over the last part of the season. He's easily fooled by like drivers. Like you give him like a hesitation dribble and like you can get an open 15-footer. Like it just is what it is. The other thing, and the thing that was so damaging, there's this guy who used to work for Detroit Bad Boys, Steve Henson. He still does like Pistons analysis on the side now. He had this like 20 tweet thread about how like Wiseman was like the single most selfish basketball player he had ever seen. And it was really hard to refute any of it, right? It's like Wiseman wouldn't make contact on screens, just like slip into space and like demand the ball like he was Joel Embiid. And it's like, dude, go set a MFing screen for Jaden Ivey and stop asking for the ball. It's like, it should have been a big clue when he like wouldn't, when you won't set screens for Steph Curry, like it makes a lot of sense that you wouldn't set screens for Jaden Ivey, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, it's just, he wants to do his own thing offensively, and that he can't be featured offensively in the way he would prefer to be. And he isn't good enough defensively to accentuate that fact, right? So in my mind, like Wiseman is completely unplayable if they want to be as competitive as they say they want to be this season. I hold no like personal animus towards James Wiseman, right? I just think you can't play him.
He probably opens the season though as their third big, right? You have Duren and Stu, and then it's Wiseman.
And then Bagley is the backup 5. Yeah.
I know the bare minimum about Marcus Sasser, and I wasn't like, this gets too nitpicky, but I was like, oh, number 31 in 2 seconds for Marcus Sasser. Can you sell me on the theory of Marcus Sasser or what the idea is with him? Because from what I do know and what I have seen, I'm just not like, oh, is that like, that was the move? Again, it's a small move, but I know so little about him.
Yeah. They like Sasser a lot. I kind of like Sasser. I was surprised they felt like they had to trade up to get him, but apparently like Boston was going to get him at 27 or something. So I get it. Right now, the team has a lot of guards, so it's tough to see where he plays in the rotation, right?
Yeah.
Like, but that, with that said, Monty Morris and Alec Burks are both going to be free agents at the end of the season. So there's definitely going to be an opportunity for Sasser to be a part of this team in the not too distant future. And like, think of Sasser as like Javon Carter with like a little bit more shot making, right? Like a really hellacious on-ball defender, a little bit undersized, but like great hands. But he was a really good shooter at Houston, both like off the catch and like being able to create his own shot. And the big improvement he made from his junior to his senior year was being able to finish around the basket. Before, he could get to the basket but not finish. In his senior year, he got a lot better finishing around the basket. And so, like, I definitely think there's a role for Sasser on this team moving forward, but it's probably not going to appear in this upcoming season. But I like him, and the team seems to like him too.
Probably the more important question, or at least the bigger profile question, is there a role for Killian Hayes on the extension eligible Killian Hayes on this team right now? He was a fever dream for, like, I don't know. It felt like maybe it was only 4 weeks, maybe it was 8 weeks, but it felt like Killian Hayes was a fever dream for kind of an extended stretch last year. Where does he fit into the, if at all, in the context of this team?
So like December to January into like, I think the first part of February, he was.
It was that early on too. I felt like I was like,
yeah, it was before the All-Star break. And he went from like the least inefficient player or the least efficient player in the league from a shooting perspective to like okay from a shooting perspective. And like you could see like the theory of Killian Hayes and like how he can make sense and have a role like in the NBA. And then you know what happened, Dan? They went to France and he had a terrible game in France, and he came back and he was just like not the same dude. It was just like I felt bad for the kid, right? You're 22, like you're playing in front of your home country. You've been playing well like up to that point, and everybody's like, "Oh, Killian's gonna go off for 30 in front of his fans," and it's like, "Nah, man." He had like 6 points on like 12 shots, and it's like, okay, nah, never mind. If anyone would like to trade for Killian Hayes, Still only 22, super duper available. They've been trying to put him in Boyan trades to Dallas for like 3 weeks, from what I understand.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it pains me to say this because I was so high on Killian coming into his draft year. But like, he's in a similar spot to James Wiseman, where like, if you want to be as competitive as you say you want to be, he probably can't play. You know, maybe we come into the season and he learned how to shoot, because he can do really everything but shoot, right? He can pass, he can
He
defend.
thinks he can shoot sometimes.
Yeah,
That's any consolation.
But like, he's a good, if he could just put the ball in the basket at anything approaching league average efficiency, he would be like a solid back of rotation NBA player. Instead, he had like an effective field goal percentage like hovering in the high 40s for like most of the year. And like that's really bad. It makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I had a lot of hope for Killian coming in. I think if he ever can just become a better shooter, there is still a chance he could like hang on in the NBA. But for right now, for next season, Monty Morris should definitely be playing over him. Alec Burks should definitely be playing over him. There's no real pathway to a consistent rotation role that I see right now for him.
I don't know what they would be looking for to get back for him, but if there was a team that had better spacing, I would be curious if a lot of the bailout stuff that we see from him when he gets inside the arc might sort of dissipate and he could get to the rim more than once every like 6 years or whatever it is at this point. And I don't know if you would trust his finishing once he gets there, but like that would be the other way that I think he can function offensively, is like if he can actually find space, attack it, and with rim pressure is going to come more free throws. You don't need to be like this ideal shooter, because I feel like when you watch him defend sometimes, like he feels like he really has it. And so I'd be interested, if I'm a team that's bad but can also roll out lineups where there's above average shooting around him, I would just be curious, depending on the asking price that Detroit sets, if there even is one.
If Killian played with the level of aggression he brings defensively on offense, he would be a much better player. But he's very passive offensively in a way that doesn't help him, and like definitely doesn't help his teammates.
You were miffed by this question. I just asked what you thought about the reaction of Beef Stew's extension, 4 years and $60 million with a club option on year 4. From what I saw, there was a lot of people not within the Pistons circles. It was, $60 million for Isaiah Stewart, and they're so committed to just running 2 bigs. And I'm just like, I mean, look at the other bigs that are involved. Like, they're not committed to the other bigs aside from Duren and now Isaiah Stewart. And I've done a poor job of this on the podcast because I think we can still get sticker shock, but like this deal is never going to be more than 10% of the salary cap. And in the final year, it's projected to be like 7.9% of the salary cap. And that's without accounting for, are they just going to do the 10% flat raises because of the TV infusion money? Can you educate maybe people who don't follow the Pistons that are listening to this podcast on what Beef Stew brings to the table and why, 8% on average of the salary cap for Isaiah Stewart is not a lot at all?
So I wasn't miffed by the question. I didn't know what reaction you were talking about, because there was a little bit of like Beef Stew is the heart and soul of this team, and paying him, like you mentioned, like less than 10% of the salary cap for the future is like definitely doable. And there was a little bit of internal Pistons fans reaction, like this guy isn't able to contribute offensively comfortably in a way that people enjoy. So it's like, why are you paying what is probably a backup center, like above average backup center money, right? And so it's like that's what I meant by like, what was the reaction? It's like, which part of that are you talking about? I remain bullish on Beef Stew. I think that I saw enough with the experiment of him at the 4 last season. Enough from him as a shooter. He had like a really hot stretch and a really cold stretch, but he kept taking them regardless. And yeah. I appreciate that, at least. And he did enough stuff like kind of off the dribble. Every once in a while, someone would attack a closeout like a little too aggressively, and he'd be able to get downhill and make some finishes that were like, oh, okay. Like I didn't know he had that. And he is also a guy that's like way younger than you think. He's also, I think, 22 right now. And so when you look at the market for like wing or like for like big swing bigs, right? PJ Washington wants $20 million. And like, yeah, PJ Washington's probably a better player than Isaiah Stewart right now. But like, do I want to pay PJ Washington $20 million? Like, no, I don't. It's like, so instead, will I pay? And Grant Williams got what, like 3 for 57?
I think it was 4 for 53.
Okay, 4 for 53 from Dallas. And like, Grant Williams is a much better shooter than Stewart, but I think Stewart holds up a little bit better defensively. Williams regressed a little bit in that area last year for the Celtics.
He's he's way more switchable, but it's sort of just like he's got the spirit, but looks really confused at times where like on the switches. And so, yeah, I would agree. And like Beef Stew is more of the, like, if you want him to, like, if you're going to play any of these guys at the 5 for spurts, you play Beef Stew as opposed to like Grant Williams, just as a rebounder, as a rim deterrent type guy for sure.
And if you play Stew at the 5, now you can switch everything, right? Because you feel fine with him against guards, like on an island, right? Maybe the rebounding behind him might be a little iffy, but like you're fine with those matchups most of the time. And so, I'm
going on at the 4 might be a little rough on the rebounding front.
Yeah, but yeah, I think the Stew number was fine. I think the length of the extension was fine. They have a team option on the final year, right?
Yeah, so which is just like that's ultimate for the team. That's ultimate flexibility, and like at that point, I think we'll be numb to like these salaries at that point. We'll just be like, yeah, why wouldn't you pick up that $15 million player team option on Beef Stew?
Yeah, and the other thing is like, you can't look Beef Stew's agents in the eye and give him less than Marvin Bagley, right? Like you just gave Bagley $12 million, and like I think Marvin Bagley had stretches last year. I was like, oh, okay, like I could see it, but like Bagley is not a part of the team's future in the way that Stewart is. So you can't like just hand him $12 million and be like, are you cool with this? Because he's better. So yeah, Stu is a subtly important piece for this
I was just
team.
about to say, he's like under the radar, mission critical to, it seems like, how they want to set up the front court, because you did mention that he was continuing to take threes, and he shot like 50% on drives last year, so that's good. But you go through the cold stretch, and it's like, right, he was taking 4 open threes a game after the All-Star break, but he shot them at like a 27% clip. And so it's like, that's not, if that happens again, there are some like existential questions that the Pistons have to start asking about the makeup of this roster.
Yeah, and what you said too is like they were butt naked open threes, right? Like teams were not playing him as a guy who could shoot. Mm-hmm. And when he had a hot stretch and was shooting like 44, 45% on those, the theory like really worked, right? Like you understood it. And when he was shooting, 29% on them, it didn't. So, and then we talked about the 2 big lineups a little bit earlier, how he's the only, like, he's the swing big that makes the 2 big lineups work. And it does seem like Troy Weaver has talked a lot about how much he loves bigs. And so it seems like he will use any opportunity he can get to get the team in a position to where they can play multiple bigs. And so like that might be a little bit of tension between him and Monty Williams. We'll see how that plays out. But like Stewart is really the key to making any of those 2 big lineups work, which is another important part of like how this team is going to do from a wins and losses perspective this season.
I'd sent you what I thought were at least 2 pointless questions about who plays a bigger role. Hopefully at least one of them was interesting. You already answered one. Monty Morris over Killian Hayes without question. Plays bigger
without
role.
question, sadly.
Is it a debate between Joe Harris or Alec Burks? Just sort of looking at, do you want Burks at the 3? Harris can at least kind of sort of play the 3.
So maybe you can answer this question for me, Dan. Is Joe Harris cooked? Like I thought Joe Harris was cooked. So like I viewed that transaction as purely financial. I didn't and don't expect Harris to really play a part in the rotation this season because he looked done to me last season. Like, do you think like 2 years after the big ankle thing, like there's a chance he can actually play?
I believe in the shooting, and this team still needs shooting. And I think he's definitely not moving like he was, but I think you could get to a point where he was always kind of sturdy enough on defense where it was, oh, he doesn't suck. And you might be able to get away with, all right,
small
if you're
ball 4, Joe Harris.
Joe Harris, you're 4. And so, and I just look at, because what Alec Burks does best, and by the way, Alec Burks was like, we did like an early podcast on like 6 Man of the Year candidates list. And like Alec Burks was there. Like that's how good Alec Burks was
really good
when he was playing for Detroit. But I just like Joe Harris is the better in theory, off-ball shooter, like peak Joe Harris. Is peak Joe Harris gone? I think that's fair. And they might just view him as like a human trade exception rather than anyone as part of this team. But I just look at like, all right, well, you have Jaden Ivey, you have Cade Cunningham. I guess if you're completely out on Killian Hayes and you're not going to test out Ausar Thompson's sort of on-ball creation as much, there's room then to just be like, okay, Alec Burks, like do what some of the stuff you do best. But I thought that was the toughest one for me, but you answered it pretty definitively. So now I'm thinking it wasn't a good one.
No, I think Burks was so good last season that and Harris's injury recovery just makes me think that like I view Harris more as like the human trade exception. Yeah. But Burks was really good though. And it feels a little weird to just like take him for granted, right? Like you asked like a little bit later on about like, are we going to trade any of these vets? And it's like, yeah, maybe. But it's also like they could have traded Burks last year and they decided not to, and then they shut him down and everything. But like he was legit useful for them. And you always, if you're trying to be competitive, you could always use a guy like Alec Burks around, right?
I was surprised at your answer to Marvin Bagley or James Wiseman.
So Wiseman made Bagley look half decent on defense. So like to give people a frame of reference, right? And there were times last season. So Bagley, he got hurt in preseason, and then he came back, and then he like tweaked something again, and then he came back a second time. And like that second time he came back, he was actually like legitimately okay in his role of like backup energy big, right? I think freed from the mental load of you were the number 2 overall pick, you have to produce for us. He was always effective offensively, always a guy who was able to put points up on the board and grab rebounds. And he made strides defensively that left me like encouraged. Like, is Bagley like my ideal backup 5 for this team? No. Mm-hmm. Do I think he's the best option for backup 5 for this team for this season? Yeah, I do. It still kind of sucks that they weren't able to get like a team option on the last year of that deal, though. He's got one more year after this.
It's coming back to you. That must have been one of the reasons why I skewered them for their offseason last year. So I did not see the theory, and still don't, quite frankly, of Marvin Bagley.
Yeah. He's a nice rim runner, and he's like the big man version of Alec Burks, only it hurts that when your bigs can't play defense like Alec Burks doesn't play defense.
You had kind of already touched upon this. A lot of teams are going to be calling about the vets that they have. Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned Monte Morris is home. They could have traded Burks or even Bojan Bogdanovic last year and didn't. Is this team kind of at the point? A lot of this is just so record dependent. But are they almost at the point where it's, even if they're not where they want to be, is getting a late first or something really worth maybe giving up the chance to bring some of these guys back and still have them in your program? And then some of them might be worth more. You know, look at Monte Morris, might be worth a little bit more on a longer term deal than if he's an expiring contract.
Yeah. So the thing is really like Bojan, right? We have heard reportedly multiple times that their asking price for Bojan is through the roof, right? And that is partially because Bojan he had a really good season offensively last season. He also is probably their best shooter on the roster. And so like if you need to replace Bojan, like you're going to need some really good shooting pieces to fill that gap. But his timeline definitely does not like align with the rest of the team's timeline. So I do think if someone was willing to give them like a real first, not like a like top 25 protected 2028 first.
The Warriors first that the Wizards got for Jordan Poole doesn't do it for you. 2030 top 20 protected.
I think if someone was willing to give them like legit something for Bojan, like they could have him. But I think other teams are kind of blanching at giving a 34-year-old guy like a first for somebody who's 34, right? You know, maybe you see teams like get a little bit closer, get a little bit more antsy towards the trade deadline next season. It's going to be suicidally competitive in the West, and so I could see somebody being like, okay, like let's just give them like a lottery protected first in 2025 and like call it. Burks, I don't think Burks is worth a first. It might be better to just let Burks kind of play it out. And Monty is really interesting. I am a big Monty Morris fan. Quick story.
Wizards fans seem to hate him last
Really?
year. I know he kind of only has like the one cadence, and like you might get annoyed at just like how much he's snaking and pulling up from mid range. But I couldn't believe how much Wizards fans just seemed to dislike him last year.
That's so odd to me. I've always loved that like Monty was a guy who was up near the top of the leaderboard in like assist to turnover ratio. I think that having a guard on the roster who can show the young guards the value of not turning the ball over all the time will be really important. Somebody pulled a clip of like Monty Williams from 3 years ago talking about how important like having veteran guards around like was. I believe he was talking about like at the time he was talking about Ricky Rubio for that Phoenix team in their like first year, but like you could definitely see how it would apply similarly to a Monty Morris type. And like on a personal note, like back when I was an actual factual sports journalist, I watched Monty Morris win a state championship at the Breslin Center, and like that was a cool moment for me. And I was able to be like, okay, yeah, that guy's an NBA player. So I always have a little bit of an affection for Monty in general.
I think too, and maybe I'm underestimating the improvement or steadiness that we could see from Cade and Jaden Ivey as shooters. But especially if you don't think Joe Harris has it or is just a human trade exception to this team, I just view Monte Morris, Alec Burks, and Bojan Bogdanovic as they just need the spacing, because I think spacing is among the most important things to helping streamline the development of younger guys who you want to see on the ball, just to sort of simplify the space that they have to work with in the half court, where they can get to the basket easier, or defenses are paying attention to other guys so that they have an easier time being able to make decisions on the ball.
Yeah, Monty Morris is going to play a really big role for this team in my mind. And that his ability to play that role well, I think will contribute to the Pistons possibly like wanting him to return after this season.
Are you ready for the cookie cutter portion of this podcast? Maybe it's all cookie cutter, but this is certainly cookie cutter. What's the top 10 rotation look like for this team at full strength? I even had a hard time assembling. I don't feel confident in anything I wrote about this team other than I think Cade, Jaden Ivey, and Jalen Duren start. And then that's where my confidence level just plummeted.
So I think it's Cade, Jaden, Bojan, Stu, Duren in the starting lineup. I think you got that right. And I think it's Monty, Burks, Ausar, Marvin Bagley. Like that is probably your bench lineup. It's like maybe that question mark is Joe Harris, small ball forward, like we talked about a little bit earlier. Maybe that question mark is Isaiah Livers, a guy we haven't talked a lot about, didn't talk about a lot last year, but
we did on this podcast. You and I did a segment on Isaiah Livers. I posted it on YouTube, actually.
The team loves him, and he gets hurt all the time, which is like kind of his thing. But when he's healthy and is playing well, gives them like a real legit like 3-and-D option with size. Maybe that question mark is James Wiseman, and I'm very sad. But I think those are like your 9 guys, right? And then like we talked about, like maybe Killian's in there, maybe Marcus Sasser is in there, and you're playing 3 guards at a time. Maybe James Wiseman's in there. So I think this team has a pretty solid like 9-man core. And then we'll see about that 10th guy.
If you were to say by the end of the season who's playing a bigger role on this team between Wiseman, Killian Hayes, who would you pick just by the end of the year?
I will say Killian, because it's easier for me to believe that Killian spent an offseason learning how to shoot than it is for me to believe that James Wiseman spent an offseason relearning how to play the game of basketball.
This will, to some extent, be matchup dependent, but what do you think should be their most used closing 5? Is it just their starting 5 for you?
So shout out to James Edwards III at The Athletic. He did like a whole lineup piece a couple weeks ago. And it was basically more or less, it's like if the Pistons ever have a lead in the clutch, I think Ausar Thompson will be on the floor, right? They will need his defense, his rebounding ability, his ability to just make stuff happen on both ends of the floor. I think they will really prioritize that. So I think it'll be something like Cade, Ivey, Ausar, Stu, Duren will be the closing crunch time lineup if they have a lead. If they don't have a lead, they're trying to get back in the game, I think you'll see more offense, like slanted more towards offense. So I think you see something like Cade, Ivey, Burks, Boyan, Duren, right? It was like Cade, a bunch of shooters, and one big, right?
That would make sense. Are there any weirdo lineups that you absolutely want to see them try?
I love this question every season, Dan. Thank you so much for this. The weirdo lineup I want to see is Cade, Livers, Ausar, Boyan, Stewart. It's like if Stewart shoots, Ausar is your only non-shooter. Nobody on that lineup is under 6'6", and you have like enough defense to like float for a 4-minute stretch like during the third quarter. And I think that lineup would be really funky and really fun.
Mine was kind of similar. I want to see Cade, Ausar, Stewart. I love Duren, but it's just I need the shooting around Cade and Ausar. And then just give me like, let's go hyper small. And we're just going to throw Alec Burks and Monty Morris out there. Just because like, those guys are hashtag shooters. And I might trust, I'm not going to lie, almost every player, maybe with the exception of like Monty Morris, is just a rebounder over Boyan at that point. I know Boyan's like the more accomplished scorer. Just give me that. I want to see Cade, but I really just want to see like, what would Ausar Thompson look like if he was just playing with 4 shooters? And like, that's your path to getting there without me leaving Cade out of the equation.
Yeah. You're like playing Ausar in the dunker spot, right? And being like, hey, like go make some stuff happen if we miss, right? And he'd be like, sure. Yes, coach. Because that's the type of dude Ausar is.
Right. And it's also just sort of like, I mean, I wouldn't think that'd be a great defensive lineup, but like Cade has good size, Ausar is good, and Isaiah Stewart's good. It's like, it could be worse. So I don't think that would be one I'd be shocked. Yours feels more realistic. I'd be shocked if they even tried mine.
I can absolutely create a worse lineup than both of our lineups.
Their current win total is set at 28.5. Would you go the over or the under on that? And where do you see them lining up in the larger context of the East?
So it is entirely possible that they win like 10 more games than they did last year, and they're still like a bottom 5 team in the league. I think they're better. They're going to be better than Washington once Washington trades Kyle Kuzma, which is going to happen by the trade deadline. Yeah. Orlando got better. Indianapolis got better. Charlotte got Miles Bridges back and is adding Brandon Miller. I think that probably makes them a little bit better than they were last season. Plus, LaMelo should be healthy. Assuming LaMelo's healthy the entire season, like they will be better than they were last year. So in that case, like you're hoping for like Toronto and Brooklyn to implode a little bit, but that's not like I think Toronto will be worse, but like not worse enough to where they'll be bottom 5 in the league. Same thing for Brooklyn. And so like maybe Chicago, maybe like everything falls apart in Chicago, like we've all been expecting for the last 2.5 seasons.
They just DeMar had the most
can't
like
make enough mid-range jumpers
season of all time, too. Yeah.
So I don't think they make the play-in tournament, but I think they definitely like make strides in terms of a wins and losses perspective. I think it's realistic to expect them to win around like 25-27 wins. So I would say under, but the optimist in me hopes they win like 30-33 games. And that's like the max I would expect.
I do think that could be the ceiling on them. And I feel weird. I'd go under as well. And I feel weird saying this about a team whose offseason I just applauded. But when you're dealing with so many developmental projects and the fact that if you're not there, even if you're not selling at the trade deadline, like certain guys aren't going to play, you're going to try out certain things again. Mm-hmm. And I can't name, if I had to pick, I'd say Charlotte is the team in the East they're most likely to be better than. Except Charlotte was like, their defense, they put it together towards the end of last year. And Steve Clifford's a
wizard. Coach. Yeah.
So, the Wizards. Yeah, that's a team I feel like they should be better than. Whereas like Washington, well, I totally forgot about the Wizards. I blanked on them for a minute. So there's like, I feel if you set the over-under on 1.5 teams, they'd be better than in the East. Like I still struggle to say because of how you mentioned they improved. Orlando, I wasn't super high in their offseason, but they just have a lot of guys that you like and could get better. I will say like there feels like real combustibility potential in Orlando where that team just might not have enough spacing. Like if they play Anthony Black a ton and you don't get a ton of development from Paolo Banchero in that area. But I think the Pistons are going to end up being like 13th or 14th in the East. And I think that's okay still, based off what this roster looks like and what the aims appear to be right now. If they assembled this team and there was this mandate to, like, you need to be like in the race for 10, then there's a real problem.
I wish I could remember who tweeted this, but somebody was like, if they had the season Orlando had last year, right? They win 30 odd games, get close to the play-in, but don't make it, and get the number 6 overall pick. Like, that's a win. Like, that would be a good season for this team moving forward. Last thing I'll say, last year the over-under was like 29.5, and we were begging people to take the under. And like this year, like I would just stay away from the over-under entirely.
28.5 is tough because it's like there's a lot to like about this team, but there's also so many question marks that I think when you can't guarantee X number of them are answered in the affirmative, that I don't know how you would even bet the under, but it might just be one of those stay away numbers. And look, Vegas is really good at this, where it's like, oh, it's like, why can't this be like 5 or like 3 wins lower? Like, this is too on the money.
Yeah. Use whatever money you were going to put on the Pistons under and put it on the Houston's under.
Ooh, that's spicy.
I don't even know what Houston's number is. Just bet the under.
They are. I actually have it because I'm recording the Rockets look ahead. I think later today to date this part of the podcast, but I think they were at 33.5.
Oh yeah, under, way under.
Yeah, I'm double checking. They are at 31.5. Excuse me.
Still under, but that's closer.
I might agree with you there. We can rename it the Isaiah Livers section, but is there anyone or anything else I didn't ask about that you think needs to be discussed?
Yeah, I only brought up Isaiah Livers once during this whole like hour-long thing. But
the over-under on that was 5.5 for the podcast, so you missed it.
Livers is really good. If he stays healthy, he gives them wing defense and shooting that they desperately need, right? We talked about like how they can't trade Bojan because if you traded Bojan, you would need to replace like the 40% shooting on the wing. Livers shot 42% from 3 in his rookie year. He shot over 40% from 3 all 4 years, or was he in college? Yeah, all 4 years of college at Michigan that he was there. He shot like 36% from 3 this last season, but he was injured for some of that, right? So like if there's just like a random 43% shooter from 3 hanging out on the Pistons bench, like they should probably play that guy. So like, yeah, I think there's a real chance Livers like factors into the rotation equation before the end of the season.
Laz, this was fantastic, informative, and entertaining as hell, as always. Are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you in any work that you're doing at the moment?
Dan, thank you so much for having me. I always appreciate this. You always bring such levity to my terrible, terrible team. It's much appreciated. Your readers and listeners can follow me on Twitter, not X, Twitter. Just do the thing where you like relabel it on your icons on your iPhones. At LazChance, that's at LazChance. I'm not on Blue Sky. I am not on Mastodon. If Twitter dies, I will be dead. You will just never hear from me again. And I'm okay with that.
I respect it. I'm more offline than ever, but I need to be even more offline. So I respect it.
Yeah.
Great as always, Laz. Can't say enough good things about you. And rest assured, I will be pestering you again in the future.
I can't wait.